such a small venue today, everyone could not make it. However, you can tell your colleagues and friends and others that in about 2 weeks we will have the video. We hope to have it up and available on our website. So for those that weren't able to be here, which clearly is not you, but your friends and colleagues that were not able to, you can recommend that they watch it on the website. I want to welcome you to our first public event for our campus-wide initiative on civil discourse and social change for the 2010-11 academic year. We're deeply honored and grateful to have Reverend Lawson Jr. with us as a visiting scholar on our campus to offer his wisdom, vision, and voice to our initiative. Shortly, my colleague will introduce Reverend Lawson, but from the start, I want to acknowledge the centrality of his life and work as inspiration for our initiative. My name is Catherine Sorrell, and I'm a professor in communication studies. Martha Lopez Garza, who's a professor of gender and women's studies and Chicano studies, and I have been working alongside a large number of students, faculty, and staff since last spring to envision and organize this initiative. As you have likely noticed, our campus is really experiencing an increased level of engagement and concern about critical political, social, and economic issues. I don't think I have to tell anyone here about the severe impact of the budget crisis on all of our lives, especially on the lives of students. The defunding of education is not only a CSUN issue, but a state and national issue that challenges us all. There's also rising awareness and concern on this campus about struggles for immigrant rights, about lesbian, gay, bi, trans rights, about women's rights, about religious freedom, as well as about the devastating impact on human lives, the economy, and global politics of the two public wars in which the United States is currently engaged. Clearly, these are issues that demand serious attention and effective methods and strategies for change. I expect you've also noticed how discussions and discourse about the important issues frequently deteriorate into derogatory and inflammatory remarks. How the discourse around these issues is often dehumanizing and sometimes even violent. Happening on talk radio shows, on television, at public sites such as the Lincoln Memorial, and most recently at Ground Zero in New York. Given the tremendous challenges and struggles for justice that we face on this campus, in this nation and the world, our intention and hope is that the initiative on civil discourse and social change will provide opportunities for this campus to engage in dialogue about difficult and controversial issues. Gain knowledge from listening to the experiences, histories, and viewpoints of others, even if, or maybe especially if, those points of view are different from our own. We also hope that we can develop the skills and strategies for constructive, nonviolent social action. We invite you to join us in making this a successful initiative. We want to thank our sponsors for their involvement and support for this initiative. It's quite a long list, so I'm going to have to ask for your patience here. But as you listen to me, what I want you to think about is the degree of collaboration on this campus to make this happen. The student organizations that have been involved and are supporting us are the American Indian Studies Association, the Black Student Union, the Chicano Graduate Student Association, the CSUN Communication Association, Dreams to Be Heard, Gender and Women's Studies Student Association, MECHA, Performance Ensemble, and the Women's Research and Resource Center. The academic departments include American Indian Studies, Art, Anthropology, Asian American Studies, Central American Studies, Communication Studies, Chicano and Chicana Studies, English, Gender and Women's Studies, Journalism, Queer Studies program, Pan-African Studies, Sociology, and then there are others, very specifically, we need to thank in terms of faculty, the curriculum committee that has really organized and been very present in bringing the ideas from these workshops into the classroom. Administratively, we want to thank the College of Humanities, the Mike Kerb College of Arts, Media and Communication, the Office of the Provost and Academic Affairs, the Office of Student Affairs, the Oviatt Library, and United We Serve, the volunteer program at CSUN. We also want to acknowledge our community partners. During the break, I invite you to go out and talk to people and learn from them about how they are taking the ideas we're talking about here and putting into action. We want to give a shout out to Dr. Sheena Malhotra, who is our web spinner extraordinaire. Also to Jessica Arana, who is a graduate student in Chicano and Chicana Studies, who created our brand and our mark. Also to the Department of Communication Studies for housing Reverend Lawson, particularly to Ben Atias, who's the chair, and Yoli Avila, who are administrators who've helped us already endlessly. Last, though, but not least, we have to thank Provost Harry Hillenbrand. From the many brainstorming sessions, his heartfelt support for the goals of the initiative, and of course, the funding. We want to thank him. Without him, this initiative on civil discourse and social change would not have been possible. We're going to have brief opening remarks from Provost Hillenbrand, an introduction to Reverend Lawson by Dr. Martha Lopez Garza. Then you will hear for about an hour from Reverend Lawson. After his talk, we want to invite you to a reception just outside for a brief light reception and refreshments. And then we want you to come back in here. So don't go away. Come back, and we'll have about a half hour, 40 minutes of questions and answers. Okay. I'd like to now turn it over to Provost Calgary.
I'll speak briefly for a few minutes about why I think this is so important. First of all, we're deeply honored to have somebody of Reverend Lawson's stature locally and nationally here with us today. And I think it's important that we conduct this conversation over the next year for the following reasons. First, we are at a historical episode when the mixture of religion and politics has proven toxic. We talked about jihads, we talked about book burnings, we talked about collusion between the church and unrighteous Nazi authorities. When we mix religion and politics, we get a moral taint in our mouths. And that's terribly unfortunate, because since at least the Reformation, the confluence of politics and religion has been responsible for progress in the West and across the world. We need to recapture that energy and that politics. Second of all, many of the values that we associate with religion are the ones that we associate with what makes a democracy work. We create a society where we benefit one another through the transfer of wealth to help the poor. We create a society where we help the next generation by educating them. Are those moral values, are those political values, are those spiritual values, or are they all three? I say we need to remember how to worship in the church of democracy. We need to remember how to love our brethren, how to respect our children, and how to bring the family of the world together. We've forgotten how to do that as we celebrate our tea parties and go our separate ways. Nonviolence is not necessarily where we end the struggle, but nonviolence is certainly where we begin the struggle. And to begin the struggle, we have to be able to articulate it and know our place in history. One of the great ironies of today is that perhaps 70 years ago, Gunnar Myrdal wrote a famous book called The American Dilemma. We talked about the racial conflict that was undermining American democracy, that needed to be solved before we could call ourselves a full democratic republic. Ironically, that was 150 years after Tocqueville wrote his great book on American democracy, where he said the same thing. And that is 50 or 60 years after Thomas Jefferson, hypocritically or not, penned the Declaration of Independence, which says many of the same things. So how do we bring together those spiritual values to reinvest our political values, with good behavior, love for our brothers and sisters, and make this world a better place? That is why we're all here. That is certainly why I've supported this event, and I certainly look forward to the conversation from which we can all learn over the next number of months. Thank you so much.
It's the 1950s, a time of economic prosperity in the United States. Yet, legal segregation and inequality exists. And a young man about your age refuses to be drafted into the Korean War. As a result, he serves 14 months in prison. What compelled this young man to take such a stance? And what was the political milieu soon after that which led this man of Christian faith into the heart of the civil rights movement and drew him to the principles of a Hindu activist? What convictions did he carry within that called him to a path of nonviolent, direct action to stand for what he believed to be the rights of all human beings? What strength did he call upon to look directly and firmly into the face of hatred and violence without striking back, without reflecting the hate? What led this minister in the decades to follow to stand up for women's rights, to march for the rights of working people to have representation, to speak out on behalf of gay and lesbian rights, and to demonstrate for the rights of immigrants to be treated with dignity and acknowledged for their contributions to society? What drove him to rally against the wars this country has waged in Korea, Vietnam, Nicaragua, Iraq, Afghanistan, on and on? Whatever guided this man to take his journey, it behooves us to inquire as we reflect upon the purposefulness of our own journeys and the footprints we leave. Now that his journey has brought him here with us, may we work together to make sense of these times of economic uncertainty, political instability, and spiritual confusion. Let us seize this amazing opportunity this year to have our own transformative moment with this honorable man, the Reverend James Lawson Jr.
Well, I want you to know that when I was first approached back in January or February around the notion of being here for this academic year, for this kind of general conversation, civil discourse and social change, I was rather excited for any number of reasons, which I'm not going to relate them to you. But personally, I was winding down a teaching contract in Nashville, Tennessee at Vanderbilt University, which is one of my alma maters, and was planning to finish it this August, last month, and to again live full-time in Los Angeles, which has been our home since July 1 of 1974. So it came at a propitious time, a good moment of transition. I was struck by the topic itself because for Cal State to tackle this issue of the need for a civil conversation, to acknowledge our common humanity, and to recognize there are huge possibilities for social change in ourselves and in our university, in our city, in our world, to acknowledge that and to try to point ourselves in those directions, it seemed to me was extraordinary. I want to express my appreciation to Marta Lopez Garza and to Catherine Sorrells and those others of you who have already been mentioned today, students and faculty and administration alike. And I appreciated hearing this afternoon the comments by our provost, which I think were very creative and unique and outstanding. I'm looking forward to this time with you, and I expect to gain as much from being here at Cal State as whatever I may be able to bring. This is a creative effort, it seems to me, and interdisciplinary effort, and that's precisely the kind of thing that I relish. This afternoon I want to speak primarily simply about preliminary concerns, and I have lots of them as we launch our time together in our effort. I was asked recently in an airport somewhere, I don't know if it was Nashville in New York, what do you do? And I said, well, I tend to be kind of a troublemaker, and I hope to stir up both people and organizations, and I come here hoping to stir you up in various ways to the good trouble, the kind of trouble that can give you an adventurous life which you cannot imagine. And I will come back to that in a moment. I will not try to con you or deceive you or lie to you in any fashion. I may be entirely wrong, but I try daily in my own life, both in the pulpit, where I spent some 43 years, and in the university, where I've spent most years of the last decade, not to deceive or to con or to lie, because I think it's so important that if we're going to get back to human basics, what it is to be alive and human, we have to try to figure out how we can live and walk and talk and act with a certain kind of serious truth. The second point I want to make this afternoon is I invite you to disagree with me and call me wrong and correct me in any way you wish, but do not call me right-wing or left-wing. Do not call me conservative or liberal or centrist or moderate. Do not call me a radical or rightist. An article in the Commercial Appeal in Memphis, Tennessee yesterday covers a part of the fact that we had informers in Memphis and elsewhere across the country, informers for the FBI, also for military intelligence, also for CIA. And this article outs a friend of mine who I knew in Memphis for some 12 years, who was an informer for the FBI, a paid informer, apparently. And in that piece, which I have not yet read yet, but which a New York Times reporter briefed me on this morning early, I was called a radical and a leftist. I want none of those categories. I think those categories that are used so much in our country today for us is a way in which the power brokers of our society seek to smother human discourse, seek to shut down human options. It's my own sense that we human beings are quite complicated. And yet at the same moment there's a grand simplicity of life that runs through us that we have to also tap. And to put labels on us in conversation, it seems to me, is a grave mistake. With 7 billion people on the earth today, or nearly 7 billion people on the earth today, the energy of that human possibility is infinite. The options can blow our minds. The possibilities are beyond all imagination today in the world, and I want to be on the side of working to lift those options up. I still seek simply to be a human being, a man who gropes with what it is to be alive, to be in the image of life itself. I call myself something of a plodder and a groper who is still seeking to know day by day how to live and how to think and how to talk and how to, above all, relate and treat people in the way in which I think all of us deserve to be treated. We need to find ways of describing one another which reflects that we care about life, we care about creation, we care about the created, and that we acknowledge our common humanity. I'm going to say some things which I hope will be disturbing, but this is from the perspective of how we become much more alive and human. The media, the governors, the business executives, the Chamber of Commerce, and yes, even often religious people do not engage in discourse which reflects on the mystery and the wonder and the givenness of human life. I will acknowledge I do operate out of a bias. I conscientiously seek to operate our love for life and the love of people. It began for me at a very early age with my family and continues today with my immediate family and with the extended family that represents my life. The third thing I want to do is to say to you of the student generation, to make to you an apology. Because many of the people of my generation expected to leave you with a far better university and city and nation and world than what we have. Many of us lived and worked and sacrificed and went to jails and prisons in order to witness to the fact that we can have social change that is meaningful and that can encompass all of us in this country and can encompass all humanity. While there are notable achievements that we can offer, my own sense is that in critical fashions we have failed. Our nation is not what the nation might have been with different direction. And the movement of which I was a part and often a strategist did not produce the people of the land that I want. But one of the things that can be said is that this kind of a gathering at Cal State is a consequence of the struggle of the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and beyond. This kind of group could not have gathered at this university, would not have gathered at this university, at many other universities across the country in 1955 or even 1965. Still, however, on behalf of Rosa Parks and Eleanor Roosevelt and Oscar Romero and a huge host of all sorts of people around the world as well as of the United States, on their behalf, my behalf, I apologize to you who are the students at this university. The fourth question I ask is, why are you at CSUN? I speak mostly to now students. Why are you here at this university? You may have already made that decision, but let's acknowledge there are many different answers, no doubt. Let's acknowledge that your parents and family and extended family would have their views of why you should be here. I don't know how many of you are here because you hope that a college degree will be a gateway to getting financially secure and wealthy. But I want to say that you do not need a university certification to steal. Period. You can do that without a college degree. The Chamber of Commerce has, across our country, all sorts of educational committees now in which their short-term and long-term goal is to control education, control the university on behalf of what I call plantation capitalism, fundamentally. There are those in the business community who insist that business has made this nation great. I disagree with that. I think we the people have made this nation great and outstanding. And if you want to use the word exceptional, I'll go along with that word. But the point I want to push very hard is number 4, is to push you on how you use your CSUN years, which can be some of the best years of your life, no matter what hard work you may have, no matter what financial struggles you may have to have. But I want to push you at the point that you use your CSUN years in order to grab hold of your life, in order to accept your life, and to take possession of it, and to become the kind of human being you can become. Let me say at this point that the most precious gift you have or will ever have is the gift of your life. The best computer you will ever have is the brain that you have been given by creation. Your life is gift through your parents, through the stream of humanity that stretches from here back beyond our knowledge or sight. But it is gift. This is the meaning in the United States of the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, that all are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For people who do not count themselves as religious, that's all right. But the July 4th, 1776 Declaration was a kind of ringing trumpet challenge to the day, to the whole world, but especially to Europe, the European civilization. You may or may not know that that Declaration of Independence in many ways is a derivative of the first chapter of the Hebrew Bible, Genesis, and the 26th through the 27th verses, where it states that God says, let us make humankind. Let us make humankind in the likeness and image of God. Now, I'm not going to push upon your notion of God that embraces a lot of opinion and supernaturalism, but those founding people and Jefferson and Thomas Paine and others who wanted that Declaration of Independence were acknowledging something of great importance. They were acknowledging that they did not come to life by their own effort or energy, that they were acknowledging the fact that life was created and given. And then that poetry in Genesis goes on to say, so God made human beings in the image and likeness of God. God made them, male and female. God made them, and God blessed that creation. God saw what God had created was good and was blessed. Now I use that to try to suggest that your life is of great, great, great worth. And this is not a thing about arrogance. It's not a thing about what the Reaganites in the United States like to call exceptionality. You are similar to the human family, but you yet are different and unique in your gift of life. Norman Cousins, who was once on the medical faculty here in Los Angeles at UCLA, was an extraordinary intellect and writer, said the chance of you being born is about 1 in 2 million. Each one of them, given the mating, the human mating process and the whole business, 1 in 2 million. Ernest Meyer, a biologist, very well known in the field of biology, has said that we human beings are one of maybe 50 billion living species that have been on Earth in the last 4 or 5 million years. But the human species is the only one that's been able to create civilization. And I add, the only one able to write music and to invent language and to build skyscrapers. The only one who's learned to invent and fly airplanes. And sadly, in the 20th century, the only species that has developed and learned enough power to commit suicide and to destroy the Earth, if not the galaxy. The only one. But you see, I'm relating some of this simply to say how significant and important your life is. Your task in the university is to launch your life in the path of becoming a competent, effective, thinking, learning person for the multitude of roles that are demanded of us as men and women in life. The multitude of roles that you have discovered and are discovering that are critical to being alive and human. You must choose to do more than just make a sustainable living. You must use college to make your life grounded in the noblest facets of humanity. It's not a question of learning the past. It's a question of lifting up the wisdom that the human race has offered us. There's a lot of stuff, a lot of war, a lot of violence, yes. But there's also a lot of humanity. There's a lot of truth, a lot of compassion. It's important to learn some of that wisdom and to try to live for it and with it and to add to it. You must choose to do more with your college career than just to make a sustainable living. You must make a life. And I want use your years as some of the freest years that you have, no matter what struggle you may have had. And many, many millions of us have had struggles all across our life. In order to get through college, I went at midnight to the Cleveland, Ohio airport and worked my senior year from 2 a.m. to about 7 a.m. loading cargo onto airplanes. And we didn't have any carts. We carried the stuff up into the planes. So a life for me has always been something of a struggle. And I know that's increased for some of you in the light of what we have mismanaged the state of California and our nation. But whatever the struggle, you will be surprised, the struggle can cause you to call upon resources you never knew you had, and energy and strength beyond your imagination. So the struggle itself can be a sign of the gift of your life. So the fifth thing I want to say then is this. My preliminary concerns. We as a nation are in sheer chaos, chiefly because too many of us, 300 million of us, too many of us, are more shaped and formed by historic racism, sexism, violence, as well as by war, not simply violence, but the violence of war as well, by plantation capitalism, which is greed and materialism. Too many of us have been shaped by these elements rather than by equality, liberty, and justice for all. Too many religious people in the United States, and I speak as an elder of the United Methodist Church, too many religious people have been conditioned by U.S. cultural matters rather than by the professed ideals or values out of their religion. And I'm prepared to defend that in every way that's necessary. I want simply to lift this up again. Too many of us, of the 300 million people, have allowed ourselves to be shaped more by racism, sexism, violence of war as well, by plantation capitalism, which is greed and materialism, than by any of the values that people are parroting, whether it's a Glenn Beck or others who parrot the values of our land. Too many people of the churches, of the religions, are conditioned by cultural matters, the shaping that these elements have made upon us, rather than by shaping those elements by essentially authentic religious perspectives and the like. I want us to remember as I say this, that we live in a country where in every decade, in every generation, all sorts of us supported taking the land from the Indians by whatever means necessary. Too many of us supported taking the land from the Mexicans. Too many of us supported slavery for 250 years and the aftermath of slavery. Too many of us supported the notion that women should be submissive to men, should not be allowed to be educated or allowed to go to university and the like. Now, under this perspective, I want to begin to help us unwrap some of what racism, sexism, violence, as well as plantation capitalism, greed, and materialism are about. We have a form of civil conversation in which we pretend that these things do not exist, that we deny them. I hope there's no one in the conversation this afternoon who denies this existence. But racism, as an illustration, representative of these other isms that I've lifted up, takes a kind of a twofold push on us. In the first instance, racism, like sexism and violence and greed, has a spiritual poison that pretends that some human beings deserve mistreatment, deserve to be dead. In Vanderbilt recently, I picked up a collection of writings from the 1970s edited by Harrison Salisbury, who was a outstanding journalist for the New York Times during World War II when I was in high school, and whose things I read in the New York Times as a high school person. And Harrison Salisbury, in the introduction to this collection, speaks about how he heard in North Dakota the whole statement that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. That's in the literature, that's in our history. Racism has a spiritual poison. So does violence. Violence makes the claim that some of you only understand being violated in order for you to behave. You can't live under normal circumstances. That's the notion of violence. The spiritual poison, the stuff that gets on the inside of our hearts and minds and thinking and attitude, and then our perspectives in examining issues around us. So there is, in these matters, first of all, a spiritual dimension. Violence was defined some years ago by the Center for Disease Control out of Atlanta, Georgia. Violence was defined in this fashion. It was defined as a public health problem, and it was defined thusly. Violence is the use of power to harass, intimidate, injure, or kill person or persons so as to then deprive them of their fundamental rights of life and their human dignity. Now that's why violence is a poison. It teaches us. You read some of the comments from veterans from Vietnam, or veterans from Iraq, and they are writing an increasing number of journals that are being published. Look up the different names that they call Iraqi people in the midst of the war. I'm going to use the N-word, nigger, but you may or may not know that Indians were often called red niggers. That Iraqis have been called by our soldiers niggers. Now, this kind of language is about, first of all, insisting that all of us are not created equal, and that some are superior and others are inferior. So the spiritual poison is critical to understanding why greed and materialism under plantation capitalism is such a poison. But then the second thing that goes on, the second dimension of these elements, is this: that then we put across 300 and 400 years all sorts of social, political, economic structures that perpetuate the poison. I don't know how many of you were paying attention to news out of Washington, D.C. shortly after President Barack Obama was sworn in. A group of congresspeople made the first bill that he signed, the Ledbetter bill. And I don't know how many of you remember the story or the incident. Miss Ledbetter worked for a factory in Alabama. She became a supervisor. She was one of 16 supervisors, the only woman. She retired. A little while after she was retired, she was given information from anonymous sources that the 15 males in that job that she had all received higher pay than she did while she was on the job. So she sued the company. And lower courts in Alabama, including federal courts in Alabama, declared that she had the right not only to receive all the back pay, that was the difference between what the men received and she received, plus punitive damages. Then last fall, our Supreme Court heard that case, and they announced on a technicality that that lower court decision could not prevail. They said that she had waited too long to file her suit. Therefore, she did not deserve the pay. I'm taking the time to do this because I want you to understand that sexism is not simply a spiritual poison. It is also the structures that continue in the United States today so that a woman with comparable education to a male receives today for comparable work only something like 70 cents on the dollar that the male makes. That's structural. It's also a part of the hidden agenda of plantation capitalism at the very highest levels in the United States. So the two dimensions. Social change requires that we confront people who carry on the attitudes that various people should not be treated equally and the like, but then also to get at the political, economic, social, cultural structures that try to keep the spiritual poison in place and that continues to teach it. So that it's not enough for us to simply say that there is no such thing in the sight of God an illegal human being, an illegitimate human being, an undocumented human being. We have to also try to get our society to take responsibility for doing the paperwork that should have been done a decade ago to help the vast numbers of folk that we're calling illegitimate residents of our society, so that they would have the papers they need and should have. It's a task that is a cleansing task of our attitudes about people, but it's also a political economic task of changing the structures. All sorts of American, well, I've said this, so I want to add one other thing. Local, state, national governments often in the last 30 years have worked against the health of the 300 million people who are residents of this society. And I'm prepared for us to discuss that. I have a very important thesis that whatever are the social, economic, political problems, they are not, they can be solved. We can be healed of them. We can be changed. But we cannot be changed if we do not make a proper assessment of where we are and what those problems are. deny, as so many in our midst, so many rather in our land, do the existence of racism and will never resolve it. Deny the presence of violence. How can you? And will never put it on the table and walk around it and brainstorm it and see what it is we're dealing with and see what now confronts us. It has to be said that the number of people who began to agitate and protest, insisting in this around 1700 in our society that we could have a different kind of society, we had needed to make a different kind of start in the human race, that they preferred experimenting with self-government rather than being governed by a king or by aristocracy or by the military or by a state religion. That was a relatively small group of people who started the public discussion in 1776 that caused the writing of the Declaration of Independence for July 4th of that year. I say to you that we are more in danger of our own forms of tyranny than we are in danger of becoming a more democratic society. There was an article in Progressive magazine back in June rather. The headline article on the front page and all of the cover of the magazine, and the major piece inside was that Noam Chomsky, perhaps the finest public intellectual that we have in the United States, if not in the world, is talking about the fact of the danger of fascism coming in the United States. And I maintain that he sees rightly, but I maintain that it's not fascism from overseas, or fascism out of the German or the Italian experience, but it is tyranny that is homegrown, that has come out of our own American experience, that we have not been willing to face generation after generation. In this 21st century, we may see our land moving closer to making those tyrannies become monolithic disasters in our nation, and you will be facing those issues all the decades of your life in this century. The sixth thing that I would lift up then is this. Many of the problems that are being examined or talked about in Los Angeles and elsewhere, especially the economic, social problems, the financial issues, avoid a singular question which I hope our discourse and time together will put on the table. And that's this. Why do we, 300 million people, through our governments, but especially through our national government, think that our safety and security relies upon nearly 800 military bases in 130 countries in the world today? You can check those stats. 800 military installations in 130 different countries in the world, with troops on the ground in Colombia and Yemen and Somalia, maybe one or two others, but then our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. With $1 trillion already spent in the Afghan war, and almost $1 trillion already in Iraq, but with an annual budget from uncommitted funds of our taxes of $1 trillion a year just through the Pentagon. And when there's talk about financial crunch and being in debt, there is no discussion about the fact that the largest form of our deficit is because of our military spending over the last 20, 30 years. 42 cents on the dollar of what we pay for interest, the federal government pays for interest on our loans. 42 cents on the dollar is what China uses from the loans that they have loaned us in order to finance their own fairly limited military. 42 cents
On a dollar.
the interest that we in the United States pay goes to China is what they use for their limited military expenditures. Why this? Who is it that we fear? Is the fear really of ourselves? Since when are the poor countries of the world where we fought our wars a danger to us? I mentioned 800 military installations, but I want to also mention the fact that no country, no empire ever in history has had navies in every ocean, has had air fleets assigned to every section of the world, has 7 military commands that cover the whole earth. The most recent command was announced in 2008, 2009, called the AFRICOM. Its headquarters temporarily are in Germany because no country in Africa yet has consented to allowing us to build our AFRICOM command center and headquarters in Africa. But we are building and plan to build military bases all down the east coast of Africa. Few Americans even see this anywhere. It's not examined. But it represents the United States continuing to want to be the superpower, the only superpower, and that is in control of the rest of the world, and that militarily has no match. Militarism is one of the reasons that this country was organized. The people from Holland who fled here in the 18th century were fleeing the conscription acts of their country, and the fact that every man had to serve in the military, and these the kings used the soldiers for their own push for empire and control in Europe and elsewhere in the world. The militarization of our police, civilian police forces in the United States, all represent a danger, that a form of tyranny which we condone can very well explode in our faces. Again, I want to suggest to you that we can be healed of the issues that confront us and face us. None of these problems are etched in stone. None of these problems are God's choosing, God making them. We've made them. Our human decisions, what's involved in the decisions we've made to be where we are decisions we can look at and unravel them and make a different set of issues. And then my last point this afternoon as a preliminary concern is this, point 8. For the most part, our society and much of the Western world has not heard of nonviolence. The word nonviolence is a 20th century word. A number of books that describe the history of nonviolence in the United States, and we do have a rather remarkable history of nonviolence, but it was not called nonviolence until the 40s in the United States. Gandhi is the man from India who invented the term nonviolence around 1906, 1907. Because as he worked as an attorney in South Africa, the Indians were being forced, Muslim and Hindu alike, were being forced to carry identification cards. They were being told we're going to outlaw all your marriages that have been performed in a church. They could be accosted on the street and shoved off the sidewalk, and a whole series of tyrannies imposed upon them. And Gandhi said he would not put up with it, he would not live with it, he was going to resist it. And so the Indian community mobilized and resisted. And after his first major struggle, he used the term nonviolence to describe what he had done. It is a 20th century word. And I want to put it on the table, therefore, from the Gandhian perspective, but then also from the perspective of how it's been used here in the United States and the way in which we used it in the movement from around 1953 to 1973 in our country, with many notable examples and illustrations. It is, in my judgment, an emerging science for how social justice and social change can take place. And I will be examining not only some of the axioms of nonviolence as Gandhi established it, but also some of the methodologies that he created, and then some of the techniques and weapons of nonviolence. I've suggested as one of the books that we use, A Force More Powerful, which is the first such document that I know of, written around the year 2000, 1999, by men who are friends of mine now, Peter Ackerman and Jack Duvall. It is not primarily a theoretical book about nonviolence, but what it does is it shows that in every decade in the 20th century, literally millions and millions of people used nonviolent struggle as a way of effecting changes in their own nations and their own countries. We are already writing a history of the 20th century in which we claim that President Reagan's escalation of the military budgets in the United States caused the downfall of Eastern Europe tyranny. That is very false. World War II effected the treaties that permitted the Soviet Union to have be the major power in Eastern Europe. That was the agreement of Winston Churchill and Harry Truman, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. It was a bad decision then, and it did not offer us a better world in Europe for that war at all. But from the beginning, students resisted those decisions, whether in Eastern Germany or in Czechoslovakia or in Bulgaria. From the beginning, faculty people and scientists and church people resisted and opposed it. Some of them sacrificed their lives in the years between 1945 and 1980 in saying no to those authoritarian regimes. It was only in the 80s that they mustered sufficient strength, people, power, understanding of nonviolence that caused the collapse of those regimes. In Poland, as an illustration, they had used little bits and pieces of violence to fight the police, to fight the Communist Party, the government. Around the end of the 1970s, Lech Waleska
And
a handful of other people decided we're going to try again. We're going to organize again. They said, we will do this nonviolently. They read Gandhi and they read King. And they insisted in the Gdansk shipyard that there would be no violence tolerated in any shape or form in this movement that became the Solidarity movement. That it would be on the inside of the factories, the shipyards, nonviolent community, treating each other with dignity, taking responsibility for all the work that had to be done, and so forth and so on. And as they turned their organizing principle around the notion of nonviolence as learned from the movement in the United States and from Gandhi's India, they effected the grassroots process where by 1988 some 8,000 members of their movement were in jails and prisons in Poland, and the authoritarian government came to them and said, let's negotiate some more. And in that negotiating period, they got parliamentary elections, they got independent unions, and they caused the communist authoritarian government of Poland to collapse and to be replaced. And they fired not a gun. It's a rather exciting story, and more books are now being written about this from scholars in Poland itself, but it's just one illustration. Now, most of us in the United States have been conditioned with violence, violent words, use of the fist. I myself was a fighter in elementary school, fought with my fist, especially with racial slurs. In college, I loved boxing and took it. I was always athletically inclined, and so I learned the ways of using the fist. But the point I'm making is that we have been conditioned to think someone steps on your foot, you step on their foot. And that has increased in the last 30 years. Our defense industry has fed guns all over the United States. In Tennessee, the major laws being debated this last year were laws about can you pack a gun into the bars and the restaurants, can you carry a loaded gun in a state park, that sort of stuff. All of this is the way. So we don't, when the word nonviolence is used, many of us simply coil in rebellion against the idea, against the notion. But I want in this discourse to help you understand that an emerging science in the 20th century is called nonviolence, and that it has the evidence of experience and experimentation, the evidence of facts, the development of theory. And Gene Sharp In 1972, at Harvard University and the Albert Einstein Institute, wrote a classic document, which I've not mentioned, but which is a document called Nonviolent, The Politics of Nonviolent Direct Action, a little 3-volume book. In that book, from James' study of written history, he shows there are 194 different techniques that people all over the world have used that could be called nonviolent techniques or nonviolent weaponry. So I will push very hard in the dialogue to get you to examine carefully nonviolent theory and practice, which I taught from 1958 all across the southeastern part of our country in the movement and in crisis situations. And finally, let me say this: I am enthusiastic about CSUN, where you had such massive activity last year, I understand, on a whole variety of issues. And I think the university is the place where we can learn how to go after solving social issues, political issues, and acting upon them. There is more activism today in the United States than I have ever imagined. It is in the university, it's in our communities. More issues are being raised by all sorts of people. But it's my contention that because we have not given our time to listening to the experience of nonviolent struggle, that our activism oftentimes does not accomplish what we would like to accomplish. So as we begin this dialogue around civil discourse and social change, I invite you, most of all, to consider the possibility that there is a power of nonviolent struggle and conflict that we have not tapped, that has resources straight back in human history all the way, that has been codified by Gandhi in the 20th century, and that if we begin to look at it and study and strategize from it, we will be astonished at what our energy personally and together can effect. So these are some of my preliminary concerns, and next week I'm going to, the 19th, the 21st rather, I'm going to speak from the point of view of the misconceptions in nonviolence and what nonviolence proposes as the next stage in our conversation. You've been very attentive. I thank you for it.
Okay, a couple things. I just want to mention, Reverend Lawson mentioned a number of resources. If you check out our website, you will find those listed under Reverend Lawson's resources. We also have a number of other lists, bibliographies, references for nonviolent social change. What we're going to do now is give Reverend Lawson a break.
For help then. All right, yes, right here in front. He had his first hand up. There you go. A green shirt. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Reese, and I was curious. This country has been founded on war, fighting. Do you honestly believe that this will help change the future, that will get it off track of getting policing every nation and just killing people for its own interest and its own greed?
Okay, very, very good question. Very important question. Yes, we can change our country if we want to change it. while the United States has had a long history of oftentimes supporting Western civilization's expansion, search for gold, search for wealth and all, we're in a situation now where we are completely unbalanced as a nation. We are way over to the side of world control and domination. And that will change. That will collapse of its own weight. We can change it, and we must change it. The primary responsibility of being a citizen or a person of a people, like the USA people, primary responsibility is for us to get ourselves informed and to learn on public matters to say yes and no. Yes to the things that are positive and important, and no to the things that are unjust, unfair. And we have to learn to do this both in our personal small groups, family, but also in the places where we work or go to the university and so forth and so on. Gandhi and other political theorists of the past have insisted, Gene Sharp has this documented in his book, that a nation can do wrong only because the people consent. If the people withdraw their consent, then even the worst kind of government will collapse. And all. So, yes, this can be changed. We must become very critical of our military policies, of our wars, but it's no use becoming critical of that if we do not see the violence in ourselves and we do not deal with the domestic violence. The violence of the lack of safety in the workplace. The last report I saw was for the year 2000, where 61 people had died or been killed in their workplaces. At 2002 was the last report I read. 61,000 that year, you see. So, and the governments and plantation capitalism have conspired together to eliminate safety measures that were adopted in the 20th century for the well-being of the people, whether in a steel mill or a coal factory or a chicken factory or whatnot. So we have to develop a thoughtfulness and a conversation in which each of us decides it's important for me not to support or sustain sexism, as an example, in male groups or otherwise. We must withdraw our consent from that, and then we must say yes to the things that are important for having a better society. So we all have that power, and we have to use it, even though it may be scary, and we don't know what the consequences of it. But you can discover how to do it in a way that will help you. So yes, we can change military policy in the United States, but we must change it from the inside here in the United States. Aye.
Hi, I just want to say thank you very much for your words earlier. It was very inspiring to me personally. But with that said, and I'm going to try to be as eloquent as possible saying this, I was very into politics until recently. I read a lot of philosophy, which kind of changed my opinion. But, you know, this is the same country that voted for Nixon twice, the same country that allowed Bush to steal the first election and then reelected him again. It just seems to be when the chips are down or when the time comes when it's doing the right thing or the wrong thing, the majority of the people who vote, which we have less than like half the country actually votes and has the lowest voter turnout of westernized democracies, we tend to vote for that which seems to be on the opposite end of the goodness that you're trying to speak about. So what am I supposed to do as a person knowing that and have tried to make change, just ends up unable to communicate with other people because they seem to want what seems to be wrong?
Well, I did try to say in the lecture that you have to remember that we've always had people who supported the degradation of the indigenous people from day one, supported slavery, sexism in various forms. So we have never had governments or economic or educational or religious institutions that basically have taken the leadership to help us not to have those issues that we condone. So I maintain that it is up to us, however, to do the work. And we don't begin out there. We begin with ourselves, becoming informed, and cleansing ourselves of animosity towards other people, cleansing ourselves of language that is violent and destructive. I do not accept the notion that freedom of speech means that I can say anything I want to say about any human being, especially of a derogatory character. And we have in Western civilization examples of this. That we have to, hate speech in Germany meant that Jews were not people. And I learned in college from reading of the reports of people who called themselves pacifists in France and Germany, in Denmark and elsewhere, that a lot of neighbors hid Jewish people, adopted the children, and when German soldiers or SS came to their doors and said, "Are you hiding a Jew?" they said no. Because the hate speech of Germany and of Hitlerism said that a Jew is not a human being, is not my neighbor, is not my sister, not my brother. And they said, I don't agree with that. So I'm not hiding a Jew. I'm hiding a human being. I'm hiding my neighbor. I'm hiding a child. And so I believe that. Now we've had the same thing go on in the United States, because the hate speech in terms of slavery and the Indian has meant that we have a long history of lynching people. And we have the group like the Ku Klux Klan that says that people of color are mud people. They were not created by God, as I talked earlier, and therefore they do not deserve to be here, and they do not deserve life. Now that is a form of political, religious ideology in the United States. And the sociologists who have studied these matters over the last decade or so say that there are about 50 million Americans who adopt the ideology of the Ku Klux Klan. So hate speech in the United States, in my judgment, is not speech. It results in the death of people, and always done that for many years. So the place for us to begin here is that I work on it myself. I work on it in my family. It may be painful and difficult to work on it in your family. There's no doubt about that, you see. But you can find ways of working on it in your family. As a pastor, I discovered some years ago that when a husband or a wife came to me with marital issues, it was painful then to face up to the issues, to what was going on. I would always, when a wife came or a husband came, I would always then call the other spouse and say, he has been to talk to me. Would you like to come in and talk so I can figure out what's going on, or we can figure out together? And we'd bring them both in. Now here's the thing I found. It doesn't matter what kind of problems we faced, that if we would put those problems on top of the table and dissect them and describe them and lift them up, that was often hard, done with tears and lots of pain. But if it was done, I discovered again and again that people would face up to the issues and would work to resolve them. Sometimes not, but a great part of the time. So I am a strong believer in the resiliency and the possibilities of our lives. So we do have to talk in our family about some of these matters, patiently, with care, because we have to enlarge the people around us, ourselves, who see the worth and sanctity of every human being, no matter what, and who want to practice that. So each one of us, in my judgment, does have that task. Now you're right. In the Obama election, the majority of white people did not vote for Obama. But a majority of the voters did. That's 53% of the voters voted for a new president. And I think that both demonstrates that we have hope. On the other side, it demonstrates our work to be done. I think it's particularly perplexing that when you have an 8-year of a presidency like George Bush's, you start 2 wars, you give the wealthy more of their tax dollars and more wealth, you have the whole economic fabric of our society begin to collapse. You allow for, and this is not one administration's responsibility. It started in the Clinton administration with the deregulation of financial institutions, so it's both Republicans and presidents who started it. You had this economic collapse. I think that one of the keys in democracy has to be that when you have a rascal who carries on some things that are really destructive, you must vote that person out of office immediately, as fast as you can. Now, you may get another rascal, but at least you've used the vote to make a substantial change. And I've never voted. I've never been able to vote for only a person who I thought was perfect. I've always voted for, a person who I thought might do the less harm. I'm talking too much. But all right, where are the microphones? Here. We'll take people who haven't tried it yet. You have your mic? Okay.
Let me pop up and ask you.
All right, go ahead, please.
This is a personal one, since a lot of the questions turn on how to act out of disappointment. Let me take you how to act in the midst of disappointment.
Right.
Let me take you back to 1968 and 69. You were heavily involved in the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
And then Robert Kennedy was shot.
Yes.
And Martin Luther King was shot.
Yes.
And the tanks rolled into Prague. And Mayor Daley went wild in Chicago. We persisted in Vietnam. And that had to be a pretty depressing moment in historical time for you. How did you pick yourself up? How did you move on from that episode? How did you recreate and rededicate yourself, given all that?
All right. Well, I think the very quick and simple answer is that as human beings, we have to work and learn in such a fashion that we do pick ourselves up the next day and start over. There's no 10 ways about that. And I was chairman of the sanitation strike in Memphis in 1968, which brought about the assassination of Martin King, and I was with him for 2 or 3 hours that April the 4th, because we were carrying on, had to reject the city had got a court order saying we could not march, and so we fought that in the court and whatnot. But part of the way in which I lived through those days was that when I heard of the assassination at something to 6, I moved around the city to announce that we would be marching that Friday, that we would not engage in violence. I went to the radio stations and television stations. I walked the streets with some other clergy, and we insisted that his death could not stop our demand for justice for the sanitation strikers, sanitation workers. And so we held to the course. I was firmly of the mind that that was precisely what Martin King himself would have done had he were he in our circumstances or my circumstances. So that was a terrible period. In a period of about 5 years, we had the assassination of 5, more killings than that, but at least 5 people who were emerging and developing in the rather extraordinary citizens of our land and of our world. And they were all assassinated. And that really changed the character of the struggle back then. But one of the resources that I have always had has been my family. My parents were quite young. Then my own family. I have a wife and 3 adult sons and now 3 grandchildren. And the family unit has been a major support. I've also had the advantage of being a pastor of a congregation where a lot of people were trying to live out and work out the changes we needed. So that was very, very important. Then my own work kept me daily trying to work, helping people, sanitation workers, so forth and so on. Counseling with young men who were not going to Vietnam and were not going to allow themselves to be drafted, some of whom went underground and so forth and so on. So I had daily work that kept me alive and kept me hopeful about what could happen. So that's a thing. You do have to have a discipline for life. And that discipline doesn't mean that you develop your religious and spiritual resources. There are a lot of people these days, there are a lot of professional people who are calling for you to learn how to meditate. I recently picked up a book by Dr. Wild. Does anyone know that name?
Andrew Wild.
Huh?
Andrew Wild?
Yes, out of Arizona. Yeah, a very interesting book. And I was interested to see this MD, who also does, what's it called? Alternative.
He does homeopathic and
Yeah,
alternative
that's right.
medicine.
Also does both. And I was interested to see that he had a whole chapter on learning to meditate as a way of having strength and health and whatnot. Of course, he also has a whole business on the food you eat and how you sleep and so forth. So you do have to develop personal disciplines that help to renew you and rejuvenate you. That's important. For those of you who are religious people, you need to be in a religious community, a religious congregation that's practicing and that's trying to require of you or call you to your best. You can do this with small groups as well. You can do it in your family. So we who want a different world, I think, must develop the personal and the community disciplines that help us to get strength and courage. The microphone is over there. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for coming, CSUN, and then I thank CSUN organizing this event. It's a very wonderful event. One time I asked at the interfaith meeting, I asked a general question to everybody. How can God-believing people do such terrible things? And one minister answered me instantly. My name is him. You have to know there's two kinds of people. One is a truly God-believing people. Second is a so-called God-believing people. So, oh, really? Is that right? And I regard you as a truly God-believing person because I'm one of your admirers. That's why I'm here, even though I'm not a student. Okay, my question is, you mentioned religious people in the United States. Sometimes I know what they're doing, so-called God-believing people. Do you think we need a religious revival in the United States so everybody could become a truly God-believing people, show love and mercy and friendship to everybody? I think that's what we are lacking in our society now. What do you say?
I will say to you that, I will say this, that we are a better society in terms of hospitality than we were 30 years ago or 40 years ago. One of the most significant contributions of the movement of which I was a part that's been called and labeled the civil rights movement is this, that all over the country we pulled down signs that said that Indian don't come into this store, colored you can't come into this restaurant, Jew you can't live here, WAP don't come into this skating arena. These are signs all over the country. How many of you have seen such a sign in a store? Huh? Never in your life? Huh? You say you have. You saw such a...
Anti-everybody. No anti-Muslim this week.
Oh, where was this in the South?
I was down in
Mississippi? All right, I suspect that in various places there are some such signs still. No dirty Irish signs and whatnot. But you may or may not realize that 1959-60 we started pulling those signs down in Nashville and elsewhere. And then in 64 there was a civil rights bill that made such signs unconstitutional. So there is more graciousness, generally speaking, than ever before. And I think one of the things that I have concluded about our present moment is this, that the Tea Party people and the Glenn Becks, when they talk about taking our country back, one of the things they're talking about, because their language betrays them, is that they want a country where there are signs again in stores and restaurants and theaters, where indeed they say no to various people in our land. And I think that's one of the shameful things that they would not admit. So, all right, religion. I taught a course in which that I entitled Jesus Against Christianity. Because I think the great figures like Jesus of the human race offers us ideas that many of us who call ourselves Christians do not really try to emulate and live. So there is such a thing as false religion that makes God into a caricature of God. There is such a thing as war gods, for example, and that's in the literature of the past. It's clear also in our Bible, where David is ordered by God. That's a war god, to wipe out an entire village and kill the women and children and the cows and the goats and everyone else, everything else, every living thing, kill them all. That's an order. But that particular god in that story is a tribal god, not the God who is creator, not the God of Moses and not the God of Jesus of Nazareth. So in the Christian tradition, we do have to make a choice as to whether or not we're going to worship an idol, or we're going to try to understand what we cannot understand, namely that our universe has come about because of a spirit of life, a spirit of love that is beyond our imagination, beyond our language, and that God has compassion for all of creation and compassion for all human life. And none are excluded. So, does that make any kind of sense? Yes. But this is why I was trying to say earlier, you see, that very often we are raised in the family where our parents, maybe unintentionally, teach us sexism or racism. So we grow up and we think that's normal. And nowhere along the line do we discover that it's not normal. It's needs to be changed, and we're living therefore a myth. And this happens in religion as well. But it's my contention that there is such a thing as authentic religion, in which you have genuine empathy and compassion for yourself and for all human life. And that makes a vast difference in how you live and how you behave. Let's go back to the back of the auditorium. Go to see 2 or 3 hands. Go to the back and then come back up front.
Thank you. My name is Soraya. I'm a Muslim and I'm not a terrorist. Dr. King said it's not the violence, but it's the silence that's deafening. I am a student and a teacher of nonviolence, and it's my passion to see that we inspire and engage and educate our younger generation. So my question to you, Dr. Reverend Lawson, is we have not succeeded so far in incorporating a curriculum of nonviolence in our schools, in our universities. Will it happen, or how can we make it happen? Thank you.
All right. I think that's very important. I think that our time together over the next 8 months is a beginning place. And as we go along, we can look at ways that we can develop curriculum for courses on nonviolence, or courses on Gandhi and King, theoretical and practical. So it seems to me the CSUN is taking a step in that direction, and some of the faculty people who helped to propose this see that possibility. We have a fierce battle on this because I am concerned about this, but the history associations in the United States and Europe have not paid attention to the nonviolent revolutions of the 20th century or to Gandhi. That's the reality. The government professors have not read or studied people's movements, not even in our own country. So this is problematic. History has tended to be written by the people who are the victors in war. Historians like Howard Zinn and Charles Smith and a number of others have said that history of a people is not about the presidents who waged wars, but history is about the development of the music and the arts and the sciences. That's the history that really has shaped the people. And that's the history that we ought to have in our books. So I think this is a step towards doing what you're suggesting for a university to put it, make it a part of the curriculum. I see 2 more in the back. Let's then do those 2 and then come back to the front again.
Good to see you back, Doctor. We need you here in Los Angeles.
Very kind of you.
I'm Jack Finley. You won't remember me. I was on the SCLC staff from 1966 to 71 in Chicago.
Uh-huh.
Did many of your workshops.
Yeah.
This is the best thing that I have heard in a long time, is you being here and the fact that you're going to be here for an extended period of time.
Mhm.
I have a dream. I think that within the next 6 months, more people in this country are going to believe that there was complicity by the U.S. government in the 9/11 towers falling down. I have a feeling that this may create some conflict with people. Now, what I'd like, my dream is that at some point, young people like you folks in here, around the world, will get on your telephones and get on the internet and say, we're tired of this shit. We don't want this thing that you people have brought us. Our parents, our grandparents, we think we can change it. Now, I'd like to know here, with you folks here, do you have any idea that anything like that, and what would the circumstances have to be for something like that to happen?
All right, you want us to change the topic, but we're going to not do that. But that is an important issue, I think. I have friends who've been raising it. All right, right here, and then we'll come back, Frank.
Hi, good afternoon. My question is, I mean, you were talking about change and us changing the system within, right? But what happens when violence is perpetuated among the system? And when we look at, for example, in MacArthur Park, what happened on Sunday when police in our own communities are the ones creating the violence. And then we have uprisings like in 92 in Watts, 65 as well. And also, you know, we have the EZLN movement that's been at war with the Mexican government. But is there an option or an idea of us looking at very differently when violence needs to happen in order to create change?
All right. By and large, in our world today, and in the United States and in Western civilization, violence is thought to be the thing that creates change. But it does create change in a certain way, but it's always negative change and not positive change. And we are so inundated in violent reactions and violent language that I don't think that we are capable of seeing where violence might have been worthwhile. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Yeah. So I don't think we can do that. The United States cannot do it because our first reaction to every incident in the world is send in a gunboat, send the Marines. So that doesn't work. I do not think that you can find in the last 80 years in political social history violent incidents that effected positive change. I do not think you can find it. Period. Now I have to say to you, I think that personally, I think that Fidel Castro, in the violent overthrow of the Havana Baptista USA-backed and trained army, was effective. That's the one incident which I think I am prepared to say was effective in national change in Cuba. But very few people who applaud that, especially out of certain political elements and romantic elements in the United States, then acknowledge the reality when Fidel Castro marched his forces into Havana and chased the Baptista army out. He then turned the purposes of his government, organized government, around the eradication of racism, the eradication of illiteracy, and development of health care to stop the dying of babies in the first year of life. And he effectively did this, though did not do it perfectly, and they still have all sorts of problems. But the primary problem with the Cuban government has been the continuous assaults from the United States on Cuba. That's been their most perplexing difficulty to solving some of their own problems and to helping to create the kind of society they want. We have been their problem. They have not primarily been their problem. You have the same situation in a different setting now in Venezuela. Yes. Hugo Chavez has twice been elected president of the country, and we are at this very moment, through the State Department, through the Freedom Institute, through the Foundation for a Democratic Society, something like that, in Washington, we are sending millions of dollars into Venezuela to try to defeat him and to put our government in place. You haven't read that in the paper, but I can document that very easily. It's well documented. So in many ways, our own country is the worst enemy for freedom and justice in the world today. And people don't like me to say that, but I do say it. I have preached it from my pulpit, and will continue to say it. And that's what has to be changed. That we have to change that. All right? Okay. I see. Here's one. Here's another hand. Right here. I haven't asked. Here's another hand over here. Okay. We'll do those three, and then we'll start. All right, 4, and then we'll pick up someone who's already talked. Then we'll go back to the back of the room. Okay. All right. Yes.
On that thought, I was wondering what your thoughts are on the plight of the Palestinians, and also the kind of non-violent actions that are occurring as far as boycotts of Israel. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, from 1948, there have been in Palestine and Israel people working from a nonviolent perspective and all. I think that so much of those efforts are destroyed by the American foreign policy, and by then the fact that we, in our foreign policy, we see Israel as being a major military base for our management and control of the Middle East and Northern Africa. So I think that's an issue. I think those efforts should continue, but they're in great difficulty as a consequence of our own policies. We'll do more about that maybe in the workshop. All right. Yes.
My question is, I work a lot in the community with youth, and I see. I work a lot in the community with youth, and some of my students also consist of AB 540 undocumented students, and they have taken a huge stance, the Dreamers, those that are in support of the DREAM Act, and doing nonviolent acts, and with the hunger strikes that recently happened here, not only in LA, but across the nation. My concern is if there's no resolution with this matter, where will our youth take it next? And mainly because I support their leadership, and I support the stance that they're taking on violence, but at what point when is enough, and I'm afraid that someone might turn the other way.
All right. All right, I'm going to say something that, may sound as like egotism or whatnot, but I thought in 2006, when the immigration rights groups in Los Angeles and elsewhere decided to do major marches, that we could probably ignite a movement that would mean that the DREAM Act could be established as one of the platforms. The failure of our immigration rights groups to continue that process of nonviolent planning and strategizing and organizing, I think, puts the DREAM Act for these students, a number of whom I met in Los Angeles and in Miami and elsewhere, put them in jeopardy, quite frankly. So I've continued to meet with immigration rights groups, and I've continued to try to say that you cannot put your energies through the Democratic Party or through lobbying the Congress. The most effective ways by which we have gotten change in the United States has come when we have organized people in such a fashion that we put our agenda in the public arena. And the presidents and the Congress could not then defeat it. And we got Congress and the presidents to make changes in their agenda. I have to say that. There are three outstanding examples of this in the United States. The women's movement of 1914 that got the voter rights bill. If you look at that movement, they disobeyed the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and they went for their own program. The working people's movement is what got Social Security passed in this country, as well as a Bill of Rights for working people, which have now been systematically torn apart. And the movement of which I was a part that put the agenda on our agenda on tape. Let me give you a specific illustration of that. In 1961, we had the Freedom Ride. There's now a movie on that, which I hope that we're going to be able to bring to campus. Just been filmed in August. We in the Nashville movement, when the Freedom Ride that was small and quite relevant, which we supported, was bombarded with burning buses and KKK and police action, mob action that injured people, almost killed people in Alabama, we in Nashville decided that we could not let that demonstration stop, so we resuscitated it. The Attorney General of the country was outraged when he was called and told the Nashville movement will continue the Freedom Ride from Birmingham to Montgomery, from Montgomery to Jackson, Mississippi. I myself was a part of delegations that went to the administration, went to the Attorney General, where we were urged to go into voting registration and to stop the demonstration. The Freedom Ride went on. 300 or 400 of us were in prison in Mississippi. In '61, we kept it on the news level, on fast, so the Kennedy administration had to then work to cause federal action, which they did, that meant that white colored waiting rooms in bus stations, airports, and train stations all were abolished. I told Robert Kennedy myself in my meeting with a number of others in that period that you can't do it if we do not nonviolently demonstrate in such a fashion that forges your power to do it and to do the right. So I think we have to understand that voting is not the major work of a nation that wants to be self-governing. The parties keep, the newspapers and others, they say, you got to vote. Okay, but voting has not produced the kind of Democratic or Republican Party that we the people deserve. And the only way for that to happen is through a long-term systematic direct action. That's my opinion. So the immigration rights movement, which is really necessary, has to move from lobbying Congress by visiting Congress to filling the streets with nonviolent action, and we can make it change. All right. Yeah.
We've got one more question.
All right, this young lady is urgently.
Please stay. We're not done yet.
We're going to finish this up.
We're
now.
wrapping it up.
Hi, My name is Margarita Lopez. I'm a student here at CSUN, and I'm also, I try to be very involved in my community. I came today as part of the Cesar Chavez from the subcommittee of San Fernando, which we organize every year in March, a March for Justice and a Culture Arts Festival and a youth conference. So we try to encourage the community, and especially the youth, to be involved, one, and to know about Cesar Chavez and his struggle and how that still affects us in the community. But my question is, and this is something that I have asked many people, and I don't seem to get a straight answer. How do we compete with MTV, with that idea of materialism where kids are hooked up to the iPods, they're hooked up to their cell phone texting 90% of the time? How do we go about inspiring or getting them to be more interest in their community, to be more knowledgeable of the history, and how do we go about change? I hear about, well, we need to do change and we need to inspire youth, but how can we compete with things like this? That's it.
Yes, it's very hard work. There's no 10 ways about that. There's no doubt about that. And most of the time we don't have the human or financial resources to do the work that needs to be done. I think that one of the illustrations of a group that has done some effective work has been the Community Coalition in Central LA. I don't know if you know of that group, but they have done some effective youth organizing on issues of education, high school, including the repair of buildings and that sort of stuff. So I would suggest that you might look at that group. It is hard organizing work. It does require one-on-one work. It does require having some serious goals and strategies for making it happen. Now, in Nashville, when I moved there to teach in 2006, I did begin to gather some high school people and college people and clergy and community activists, and we met every Saturday morning in what I sort of called is like a boot camp. Hard examination of our situation with the idea of then trying to figure out how do we move. So there have been a number of byproducts of just that one effort, and I'm going to continue to go into Nashville at least once a month to work with that group. They have developed now a program that they call the Urban Epicenter, and they are continuing that Saturday morning way as a way of training and recruiting people in nonviolent action and understanding the situation in which they live. There is an excellent union in Los Angeles that has done this kind of work. I do not know where they are because I have not spent time with them in the last 4 years. But 25 years ago, Local 11 started doing the empowerment of the workers. And I've been deeply impressed by that group. Many young people involved in it. I did workshops on nonviolence for them 25 years ago. Maria Elena de Rosa was once the president. She became president at age 23 of that local union, fresh out of college. And so that's another example where there is organizing going on that shows effectiveness. And what I'm saying to you is simply, it is the toughest work in the world in many ways. Very few people, very few churches, very few high schools are doing that work. And I just commend you to go after it, do it, use it as an experiment, and you answer your own question in time with your work. It may not happen in 1 year or 2 years, but it can happen if you and a number of others are committed to making it happen.
Okay, folks, I know we have more questions, but we have to actually move out of the room.
Yes.
1 second, we're going to give Reverend Lawson an applause. By Reverend Lawson is next Tuesday in the OVIAT presentation room. That's in the basement of the OVIAT. It's a bigger room. It will be at 4 o'clock, the 21st. We also have workshops that we're calling student workshops. The community is invited, but they're really focused on students and developing strategies for the type of change that you want to make happen. The first one will be on September 30th. All of this is on our website. If you put in CSUN's website and then you put CDSC, which is Civil Discourse Social Change, you will be taken immediately and magically to our website. And we hope that you will come back to the event next week, but also to the student workshop. One more hand for